morning, everyone. It is a joy and a pleasure. I want to get a couple of my books here. A joy and a pleasure to be with you today for the Q&A time, and in particular to talk about the subjects at hand. Now, I will say some of my Q&A times are difficult, and that's because your questions are difficult. Now let's look at what I've talked with you about in the past. There's a difference between fact and opinion. Opinions are all over the place. Facts are generally substantiated, although there is a subjective element to it because we can get different types of information. So let's start out with a premise about our tradition that is, for most of us, impossible to refute. On the basis of the Christianity that was discovered in the United Kingdom, I use that term loosely because it wasn't called it back then, it was very evident that there was a very, very, very early form of Christianity. I had the privilege of being in Moscow. I better not say much more than that, but in Moscow, discussing a number of ecclesiological and ecclesiastical matters. I think I can say that. And what I was impressed to discover was the people with whom I was meeting in Moscow knew more about our communion and about our traditions than a number of new folks in our tradition. In many ways, it was easier for me to talk with them because they knew our history. Because they and most of us operate on the basis of the fact that we are part of a communion that was not established in the 16th century. In fact, our ecumenical relations would be non-existent in the larger communions if they believed that premise. And they believe, because they see elements of their own traditions that were there and continue to be in what we have been over the centuries, a commonality that needs to be looked at, not just Jesus Christ as Lord, I might add. That's what I guess I'd call non-negotiable, almost why bother to mention it. Well, no, I take it back. I've been a bishop for 26 years. I didn't believe I'd have to tell people that. Or it's the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, two natures of Christ. You know, don't operate on the basis of assumptions, folks, but do operate on the basis of truth. Now, the problem is, even though in the British Isles, the United Kingdom, Christianity dates back to, well, you know them all. And if you are a part of the community in which you live, just for fun, I want you to mention in your minds, or out loud if you're there, some of the saints that were produced during that pre-16th century history. Then just for fun, I want you to mention the various liturgies that might have been celebrated. And here I'm not talking about Mass versus morning prayer. That would have been unheard of. But I mean, think about all of the Eucharistic liturgies that were celebrated in what we call the British Isles, United Kingdom, and what some of the names were. If you start out by saying the 1549 Book of Common Prayer, I humbly ask you to do a little more reading because you'll be thrilled by what you read about. And if you like to celebrate St. Patrick's Day, you don't want to start in modern history of not quite 500 years ago, do you? So let's look back and consider all the things that were going on in the name of Jesus Christ. In fact, incredible missionary endeavors. To put it a little differently, anybody today who is interested in church planting, if they've not read about the ways the Benedictines did it, the way they did it in Iona, the way they did it in the White House over there. If they haven't read St. Ninian, if they haven't figured out the difference between a minster and an abbey and a priory, then they've missed out on some of the most dynamic church growth and church planting that you would ever imagine. Oh, it's thrilling. It really, really is. So read it just for your own edification, because you'll learn so much from it. Now, the next part of it is, however, that as you recognize, the Church of England became a state church. And anytime you have the state and the church together, you recognize that there's always kind of a spillover. So don't focus on that, please. But the other thing I do want you to really focus on is what it means to be established. And sometimes what it means to be established keeps on changing. Now, there was a man by the name of John Wesley who was pretty concerned about Anglicanism, and what I'm going to talk about today is what helped inform him. There wouldn't have been a Wesleyan movement, in all probability, had it not been for the Oxford movement. So go back and read what John and Charles Wesley wrote. And you can read what their dad, the priest, had to write too, because I don't know how they fit all of those priest kids into that rectory, but there they were. And look at what they wanted to do. I'm just going to summarize it, and it's not the most accurate summary, but that's because I could teach a course on this subject. But I guess the question would be this: if the church does not seem to be doing what she was designed to do, what do we do? For example, if the Western Church had been doing everything that it should have been doing, or she should have been doing, would there have been a need for St. Francis of Assisi, who was a reformer? Wasn't he? That's what he was. He was a reformer. But he was what I would call an institutional reformer. He worked within the system. Now then, if we look at what eventually became known as the Oxford movement, I think you know that it's terribly difficult to talk about the Oxford movement if you haven't read this book or books like it. And there's a reason for that, because the Oxford movement, and there's a fairly well-known man who writes a lot, and he doesn't understand the difference between Anglo-Catholic and High Church and Spike. And the differences are so extraordinary that I just don't know where to begin. But I would recommend to him and all the others, do some more reading on these subjects, because if you would read They Shine Like Stars, the story, what was it, of the great church revival by the Reverend Desmond Morse Boycott, author of 10 Years in a London Slum. Now, in there, you will undoubtedly come across a few names. I think one of the names that you're going to most certainly come across is the man I've been talking about today, whose day we celebrate today, and that is Edward Bouverie Pusey. And I think many of you know that in England, a whole series of magazines came out with some of the great figures of the time. And I'm blessed because what they also did is they wrote, well, I have something that says certificate of authenticity, you know, that's great, but men of the day. So they would write a history of that individual. Here's one of the most extraordinary things ever written about Pusey, but it wasn't done by a theologian. It's what the church was absolutely calling the church to be and to do. So what we did at that time is, when we recognized that the church seemed to have forgotten some of her prayer book and had forgotten some of her history, and as preferments occurred and clergy were being placed into benefices and into glebes, I'll talk about that another day, glebes, and many of them, the priests only visited their parishes upon occasion. No, I'm not talking about bishops, priests. This really troubled some very conscientious people. And to begin the process of writing something called Tracts for a Time. Much of this happened in Oxford, so it eventually became known as the Oxford Movement, or the Revival. And unfortunately, if people haven't read their history, that means for some that means that every now and then there might be some incense. They'll be wearing Eucharistic vestments all the time, and all those other kinds of things. That's what happens when we don't read history. We latch on to an external. But if you've ever read the Tracts for Times, and, well, you just need to, because it'll explain to you what do you do when a culture and a society has become settled and sterile. And the type of Anglicanism that was being celebrated, if you will, at that time, lacked what you might call enthusiasm. Later on, you'll remember what Wesley has to say about it. But it also, in many instances, lacked theological enthusiasm, and it degenerated into a situation that is very easy to fall into. And that is, I will define the church on the basis of my experience. So, if in the early 19th century, people would define the Church of England on the basis of their experience, in many instances, with really notable exceptions, really wonderful notable exceptions, because God always raises up saints even if we haven't read about them. We can honestly say that the sterile nature which tended to put a major emphasis on the institutional side of things as a church state, a state church, spilling over even into Parliament, well, something more was needed. And the recovery of our heritage was wonderful. Now, some of you have heard me say this before. This one will be very offensive, so I need to tell you that to some. However, it's not meant to be. I've always said, wherever it is, whichever group, that the church can suffer from neo-Mormonism. Now, Mormonism, sorry my friends of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, one of their premises is, nothing of any value happened in the church or any significance after the death of the last apostle until God raised up Joseph Smith. So that whole period doesn't count. And there are some of us who suffer from the same problem. Nothing of any value happened in our communion after the death of blank until blank came along. Now, you get to fill that in. But I have to tell you, most of you know what a healthy respect and admiration I have of Thomas Cranmer. But he was not infallible, and therefore a healthy respect also means reading and studying. And while I would use him along with other luminaries as marvelous touch points when I'm lecturing, there is not what one can call the one architect or the one authority. To do so is intellectually dishonest, and it's historically strange. And so, that being the case, you have to ask yourself the next question. Has God raised up anybody of any value or interest since your hero, wherever that was or whenever that was? Answer, if he's God, you better believe he is. In fact, guess what? Today, someone was born, we don't know their name, but 35 years from now, they may be saying something that will really shake things up in a positive way. But we don't know that. So us knowing who they are, where they are, is immaterial because we are not so important that we deserve to know everything. But we can't get in God's way. and tell God he doesn't know what he's doing. So you just have to accept that the Oxford movement was revolutionary, and it was marvelous, and it produced saints. It also restored godly religious orders. In the 16th century, with the dissolution of the monasteries, do you think everybody was corrupt? I don't think so. But what it does mean is that situations can be corrupt. But Blessed Edward Bouverie Pusey helped bring back religious orders. He refocused people on how important the sacraments were. He took us back to understanding something really important. There's no such thing as three streams. I mean, I read about that and I smile a lot. I don't offer opinion unless I'm asked usually. There can't be three streams. I mean, there can be three expressions. But the church is in her essence the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. And being a Catholic is not a stream. That's the essence of the river. Now, there are, in contemporary life in our church, three specific ways in which that can be expressed. And I'm not even saying that one's better than the other. But let's be really honest with ourselves. It's a little bit like saying, I can give you three things which I can support as being truth, and all three of them are equal even though they're different. So it puts us in the position of having to ask a question. Is there a difference between objective truth and subjective truth? And to make it a little bit easier, is there a difference between capital T truth and small t truth? Small t truth is what I have decided I want to believe, even though it may not be based on any hard data or studies. And one of the situations that I'm engaged in right now, and I was talking with a priest about this yesterday, he and I were in seminary together, and it was, I said, Father, have you discovered how much less we know now than we did when we were 28 years old? It was true. I knew a great deal more when I was 28 years old. But today I know infinitely less, and the reason is because I've read a great deal more. The more I read, the more I discover that I don't know. Now, the church has raised up mighty people. Look at this man right here. Now, some of you say, I have no idea who he is. Okay, well, if you don't, I'm going to give you his name. And if you don't know his name, then I'm going to ask you to do something about it. All right? This is, once again, from the Vanity Fair group, just like the other one was. And this one, by the way, was printed, this actual one, September 1890. I have a whole collection of these, by the way. And this is of the Bishop of Lincoln, famous Bishop of the Diocese of Lincoln in the Church of England. His name was the Right Reverend Edward King. Now, if you've never heard of him, then once again my suggestion is, please go back and do some more reading, because you're going to be blessed by what he did and how significant he was. Okay. One question that came forward, therefore, that needs to be looked at was, didn't Dr. Pusey have something to do with the Oxford movement? Astute question by one of you this morning. He had more to do with the Oxford movement in many ways than even several of the others who were given credit. Indeed. And he died in the most humble means and amassed money enough that when he died, he gave it all so that many of the causes, like women's religious orders, for example, could prosper. Now let's look at the next step here with that in mind. I try to read all of our communion's church history, And I have read carefully some of the more modern manifestations of it, like the East African revival, which is a recent phenomenon, and one that I appreciate immensely. But it cannot be understood apart from the African missionary work that was being done by religious orders from the Church of England. It cannot be understood or appreciated apart from the trailblazing work that was done so that English, the Book of Common Prayer, and other gifts that we had to take were there. Now, admittedly, sometimes you need some more spark plugs, but to say that there was no East African revival by those on one side who might say we did it first before you came, or the other extreme to say we're trailblazers, nobody was here before we got here. That's historically dishonest, but it's also somewhat arrogant. And arrogance is not a good thing for us to have, because it means that we know more. But the real problem is we make ourselves to be the judges and the standard against which we do all of this. And so if there are things that we need to have today, we need to have greater humility, because I think we are living in an age where I can honestly say, never have so many known so little. But because they have opinions about it, it sounds like a lot. It was a little bit like when I was a parish priest. If somebody would come to me and said something like, Father, there's a lot of talk going on about X. Generally, that was designed to get my attention so that I could change something. And I was always open to conversation. But those who know me know that one of the first things I will say is, please quantify. Because here's one extreme. 100 people all saying the same thing, and that is amazing, needs to be looked at. Or 2 people getting in touch with about 100 people and saying, don't you feel the way I do about this? And don't you? No? Okay, I'm going to go back. By the way, Father, lots of people feel this way. And the other ones who have been asked are saying, I don't think I said that, but okay. So be careful, very, very careful, because sometimes when people want something, they start phoning people on the phone, and they start texting and emailing people and say, don't you feel this way about him or that, or what's going on? Folks, that's dishonesty, but it's also arrogance, because it means that we know more than others about that. Okay, take it to the next step. When you look at the Oxford movement in particular, if you were given that opportunity, as I said earlier, to be able to have a glebe, which means you can have this property, you can have animals on it, you can plant things, you're the priest, and any money you make off that property is yours, goes right to you. That's a glebe. And others, by the way, you can have these 3 parishes, so you'll get income from these 3, and by the way, Lord Townsend over here is the one who pays your stipend. And Lord Townsend gets to decide who the next priest is. The English system is not as simple as systems in other places. In many instances, it has produced a system whereby there were families who actually had their own chaplains. Little churches sometimes want their own chaplains. In other words, they want the priest to be their own chaplain. Most priests are not capable, excuse me, of being a chaplain to 4 or 5 people, because they have a lot more they have to handle. But oftentimes people want their own chaplain. In England, oftentimes a family could have their own chaplain. They provided a church, a place to live. In fact, that's what it was called. This priest has a living at St. Swithin's and may not have any parishioners, except those who live on the manor. Well, the Oxford movement thought that was a little bit strange when they were going down among the unemployed, blue-collar, working-class people who were never even going to be invited to dinner with all of these others. You seriously think that those uncultured, in many instances, working class, poorly dressed, underpaid, discriminated against people are going to be invited to high tea that day? Pretty much no. In fact, I challenge you on this one. If you have a sign anywhere at your church that says all are welcome, sit down with people and find out which ones aren't. Think of the kind of people who might read that sign and therefore feel really happy because it says all are welcome. They walk inside the church and people start staring at them. What would those people look like? Who would be stared at? Are they welcome or not? Now, welcome doesn't mean you can stay in that pew and afterwards we'll give you a donut. That's not what that means. Welcoming is more than just saying howdy do. In fact, what I oftentimes would say to my churches in my diocese, I'm sure glad that the church says we welcome you, but put another sign on that says we just don't know what to do with you once we've welcomed you. Well, the Oxford movement asked that question. What do we do once we welcome somebody? You know what they concluded? These are not stupid people. Just because of the circumstances of their life doesn't mean that they're stupid. But what they need to have happen is they need to be treated as if they really are worth something. Fed, loved, families being cared for. All of those kinds of things that you like when you say you wish somebody really loved you and appreciated you. They were no different from you and me. And beloved, they're no different today. If somebody wants to plant a church, I challenge them to go under the bridges. I challenge them to go into the poor neighborhoods. I challenge them to go to a place where nobody can pay for that. I challenge people to go into places where they're not always going to get affirmation day after day, because broken people don't always give out the kind of affirmation that some people would like to have. And whether one likes that or not, that has been the mission of those of us who've identified as being Anglo-Catholic. Now, here's where it is. We worship God with all the beauties that we have, the unbroken tradition, treating him as king. And then we turn around and we go out into the streets and we treat the broken people as royalty because they are sons and daughters of the king. These people don't want Pastor Fred running out somewhere and with his guitar. I know you don't like that. But assuming that one size fits all just because it worked in this place or that place means sometimes predetermining what works without going and being among the people and living with them to find out what's happening. You know, Father Damien, of Molokai, the one who died ultimately out there with people, went out to Molokai, the leper colony, and he was assigned there, and he hated it. He was condescending at first. And he was out there to do ministry to these people with leprosy. But you know, one day when he lifted his hand up and the sleeve went down and the people saw that he finally had leprosy, what he said was fellow lepers. We need to stop ministering to people. We need to learn how to minister with people. In the gospel for today, it talks about Jesus being invited in to eat. And an unnamed woman washing his feet with her hair, with her tears, anointing his feet. See, what Jesus said to you and me, all these things are examples of what you and I are supposed to be doing. So you'd like to have a church in a snazzy neighborhood. I think it needs to be. There need to be people to do that. But part of our tradition is we go and search out and seek the people that nobody else wants to welcome. And we share with them what we have learned through sacramental theology. The emphasis in worship is not on the people. No, it really isn't. I mean, that's part of one of the modern day heresies, that we are, the worship is for the people. The worship is for God, where we can proclaim Him in a fashion that is unbroken in terms of what people see, so that they can have normal when the world is abnormal, when they can see with regularity those major things that are taking place. Now, that doesn't mean if I decide I want to move this book, or I want to move that lamp, or move a candle, or whatever. That's not what I'm talking about. But what I am talking about is the essential element: bread, wine, water, the same vestments. Whoa, where'd you get that one? Or, wow, I've never seen anybody with a t-shirt and stole around their neck holding up a water goblet before. All of those things are distractions to people, even though we may think they're relevant. So to be relevant is to be able to worship God in a way that shows Him honor and respect, and have the people with us in that regard. And at the very end, as we're being sent out, to go out and find those people and treat them as royalty. Now, beloved, high church doesn't mean wearing a chasuble. You know, that's the outer vestment. That's not what that's all about. Being Anglo-Catholic doesn't mean that you use incense more often than somebody else does. Being a spike, that means you know what all the externals are, but you're not yet 100% clear as to how it all connects with systematic theology and biblical works. You know what to do. From my perspective, that's a little bit like working at McDonald's, wearing the uniform and serving no food. The uniform and the food kind of go together. The way in which we treat people when they come and say they're hungry, all those things kind of tie together. It's a total product. Our tradition goes back to the upper room. Our tradition goes back to Jerusalem. Our tradition was set out as a missionary endeavor throughout all of the world. And if we didn't think so, then we have to ask ourselves a question. Why did St. Paul waste his time? He should have just written letters and not gone anywhere. But you know, it's interesting to take it a next step. You know what Jesus said, "On this rock I will build my church"? Remember that? Do you know where that was? Well, it's a place called Caesarea Philippi. It is one of the nastiest looking places I've ever seen in the Holy Land. I mean, it's attractive. They've fixed it up. You know, they want tourists. But it's all rock. That's why you say "on this rock." It has caves behind where they used to worship the local gods of the shepherds, usually the god Pan. And that's when they prayed, they went like this all the time. And their way of praying was called panic, because that was their response to the god Pan. And it was there that he said, "On this rock I should build my church." Now, some would like to say, obviously he's talking about Peter. But oftentimes people say that don't go to the actual scene, because everything that Jesus does in the scriptures is not an accident in terms of the geography. It really isn't. He selected those places, and you can see why when you're there. And so, in effect, Jesus did church planting in a bad neighborhood. Jesus did church planting in a very difficult place. Or some say, he did church planting in the low rent district. If Jesus was interested in building a large operation He would never have done it at Caesarea Philippi. But I think you and I are working towards understanding why Jesus says what he does. Now, I think everybody needs to bloom where they are planted. And that's why I have a healthy respect for the breadth of Anglicanism and the church as a whole. But I would say this to you as a couple of concluding thoughts. I, being brought up for most of my life as an Anglo-Catholic, born into Anglicanism, have had to go through some years of discrimination by fellow Anglicans because of their perceptions. Like one priest said to me when I was a young priest in a particular diocese, and he was in a very large and wealthy parish that was very plain and simple. He said to me, "Why don't you just become a," and then he filled in the blank about another church. And that's because he saw what my church looked like and what the ornamentation was and the way I was vested. So he made an assumption in his mind. And I said, "With all due respect, sir, I would not, after having met you, seeing that you wear a shirt and a tie, and see you inside your church, have said to you, why don't you just become a blank and fill it in with a church that comes out of what one might call the Reformed movement." That would be arrogant of me, condescending. It would also say I don't understand enough about it to speak with intelligence. So before you and I decide we want to criticize other expressions, we need to find out more about it. Particularly today, when we are very attuned to the theme of discrimination. You need to understand that we Anglo-Catholics weren't just discriminated against in England. We were imprisoned. We were put in prison because we were not conforming to what some in the church were saying we were supposed to do. In this country, even though so many of these heroes of the faith came over and founded religious orders and movements within what became later known as the Episcopal Church, we were not always invited to serve on the most prestigious committees. And that was okay, because it's not about being prestigious. And finally, I'm going to leave you with, I hope, is a summary. I was baptized in a church called St. Stephen's in McKeesport, Pennsylvania, right in the middle of what is the Rust Belt. My brother still lives there. My cousin called me last night telling me he'd just been there, and now he knows that he must always lock his car doors and moves kind of quickly in his car when he goes through the neighborhood I lived in that community, where my Swedish family and my Welsh family moved and were brought up. But a member of St. Stephen's Church in McKeesport was a man by the name of Mark Connolly. And if any of you enjoy literature and you enjoy reading, then it's M-A-R-C, by the way. Look up Mark Connolly. I'm not going to tell you anything else. I love when people read. And one Sunday, he had said to his mother, "Mommy, I want to go to the 11 o'clock today instead of the 8 or the 9:15. The Eucharist celebrated 3 different times." Okay, Mark. So they went to 11 o'clock. He's a little boy, and he started crying. And his mom looked at him and said, Mark, what's wrong, honey? Why are you crying? I've never seen you cry in church like this before. He said, well, they're not here. They're not here. I don't know what you're talking about. Well, you know, the princesses. She said, Mark, I just don't understand. He said, didn't you hear Father say last week that after the 11 o'clock there was going to be a meeting of the Daughters of the King? Which was a women's group, still it's a women's group, a devotional group primarily. And he said, well, I don't see any of those princesses. Literally, he took it literally. Now here's my task for you. If you sometimes feel as if the way you were brought up, like with me, that something has walked away from you and left you not what you understood the faith to be, and that others have come into our communion and they say, we really like what you're doing here, but hold on, we've got to make some changes. If you sometimes feel a little bit sad about all that and discover that people really don't understand the family that they have come into, well, you know, in the end, it's a little bit, and I hope you've all read this, but you really need to look at what the Bishop of Zanzibar once said when he was speaking to one of our gatherings in England called the Catholic Congress, Anglicans, Catholic Congress. And what he said was, well, now that you have all the accoutrements, you know, now go out and find the broken. Go find the downtrodden. And in effect, what he was saying, when you found them, then share Jesus with them, because just as you say that he is the most blessed sacrament of the altar, and go and share him with others. And that's where I'm with you today. If you think there's any credibility to this tradition, don't listen to those who have discriminated against us because we're too whatever, I don't know, whatever they say these days. But what I'm going to ask you to do is to go and find the people that nobody is looking after in the church, who depend upon social agencies when the church should be there. And you know what you're going to discover when you get there? You are going to discover Jesus. And you know what he's going to say to you? He's going to say to you, I wondered how long it would be before you got here. And then you get to decide when it says the church welcomes you, who's in and who's out. Well, obviously I'm passionate about the tradition into which I've been born, that my Welsh family, my English family lived in before they moved here. I'm passionate about it. But it's because I have seen the saints that it's produced. And if you haven't, may I humbly ask you to go do some more reading. I've read some of the other ones, and I'm grateful for what they've done and what they're doing. But please read the whole history, not just a select portion. And by the way, the reason I said Father Tim Kavanagh is because he was off in Ireland asked to hear a confession. And generally speaking, priests are not free agents. They usually check in with the local parish and with the bishop. And that is all I'm going to say. God bless.